Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this NLA webinar, which is part of our culture program, which is kindly supported by Here East. I'm Peter Murray. I'm Curator-in-Chief at NLA, which is London's network for the built environment. And today we're going to hear from experts about the esports and gaming industry and its impact and opportunities for the built environment. And recent research by Ofcom found that 62% of adults in the UK played some form of video game in 2020 during the pandemic. So with the gaming industry soaring, what do built environment professionals need to know to get up to speed with this sector? And what impact could it have in the way we develop and design entertainment venues? Before we start, I'd just like to remind you that there will be a chance to ask our speakers some questions at the end, so please do post your questions using the Q&A button as normal on your screen. So to give us an introduction to the field and tell us about esports, I'm going to hand over to Nikki Whiteman, who's Director of Emerging Trends at Savills. So Nikki, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. It's very good to be here. So in my role as Director of Emerging Trends, I am focused on looking at the future of how we're all going to be living, working, learning and playing. I've been in this space, which is very much about physical worlds meeting digital worlds, for a number of years now. I was part of a project bringing together industry professionals from gaming and esports with real estate. I think I sat sort of somewhere in the middle of those two worlds, trying to help everybody understand their competing languages and business models. We started looking at how you might think about creating an esports ecosystem and what that might look like. A little over a year ago now, I was asked to do the Think event by you and I, with the presentation I gave at that time, which was called Don't Put Gaming in the Corner. So we are now a little more than a year on. A lot has happened. And so this is a really quick dash through some of that presentation, updated a year a little bit on. So if you can flick onto the first slide, that would be great. Thank you. This is a sector where large numbers, I mean, we've touched on some of them already, tend to, if we're not careful, really sort of dominate the conversation. I'm going to give you just a little bit of background to the scale of this market. When I started looking at it, we were talking about something like 2.5, 2.6 billion gaming enthusiasts globally. We're now talking about 3 billion. We're moving towards a number of 3 billion people in the world who enjoy gaming. Here in the UK, we are a country where we like to game. We are something like the 5th biggest market in the world, the biggest in Europe, with over 36 million gamers. Last year, the industry here hit a record of £7 billion. So this is a substantial part of the UK business landscape. Other key global markets, of course, here, UK, China and South Korea. It's worth saying in terms of scale of markets and what's driving some of that markets. Last year, I think, one of the big stories was the release by Nintendo of Animal Crossing New Horizons. And when we look at some of the stats, I think that was really pretty impactful. Next slide, please. In creating an ecosystem, somebody in the games industry said to me, if you're thinking about who is your anchor tenant, then your anchor tenant is the community. This is a sector in an industry where it's incredibly important to understand this community. They are typically younger. They are typically engaging with content and products and brands in a unique and different way to how we would traditionally think about how people come at that. It is important to create what I would say would be a relevant voice in this space that really reaches this unique community. It may surprise you to know that girls and women enjoy gaming too. The rise of particularly of mobile gaming has seen increasing that demographic shift, so an important part of who this community are. And going forward, I think we, as per the success of games like Animal Crossing, I think we can see game developers, my prediction would be that we'll see game developers understanding this increasingly diverse community and looking to develop games for that consumer group. So I would anticipate a diverse, inclusive kind of space that we're going to see in this community going forward. Next slide, please. Gaming companies, if we're thinking about just here in the UK, then this is, of course, a story about London and some of the big cities in the UK. But it is really, if you look at the UK Games map, it is a cross-regional story. There are gaming clusters across the UK. And I think that is an important part of how we will sort of see this UK market developing, everywhere from Guildford, Slough, Leamington Spa, up to the Dundee Games cluster, over something like 30,000 jobs within this space. So as you can imagine, in a hugely important part of UK and UK growth, I would say. We've also seen big tech in this space, released by Google, for example, of Stadia, sees the relationship between big tech companies and gaming. And of course, this is a skill set that is underpinning other industries as well as pure games development. And the interface between gaming technology and other technology in the creative sector is really very significant. Next slide, please. And of course, what's driving those industries are skills and talent. I mentioned Dundee. Abertay University was one of the first universities offering computer games courses and has been an important part of the growth of the Dundee Games cluster. We are seeing, of course, those sort of more traditional computer gaming courses, and of course, courses now developing hand in hand with esports organisations for that emerging esports market. So we're seeing the rise of BTEC courses across the UK, university courses developing to support this space. And also, I suppose the other part of this, I'm sure Gavin will touch on this, is the growth, I suppose, in grassroots and collegiate esports, which is a super important part of the whole landscape of how this industry is growing. Next slide, please. This series is about culture, and I think, for me, one of the really incredibly exciting parts of this industry is how it interfaces with other creative sectors. I could spend a long time talking about fashion and music, so this is going to be a very abbreviated version. But the relationship between the fashion industry and the games industry is incredibly exciting. This is sort of two huge creative spaces coming together to create fantastical worlds. We've seen here exciting collaborations between luxury brands like Louis Vuitton and Riot around League of Legends. We've seen, as in Animal Crossing, we've seen designers, move into the sort of Animal Crossing space. We're seeing now fashion designing its own games. We've seen recently the launch of Afterworld, and that as a sort of luxury designer in this gaming space, designing their own worlds so that you can experience, their designs, their products. I think an incredibly important part of where fashion is going. We're seeing gamification in the fashion industry, which I think, for me as someone who's looking at the future, what we're seeing in fashion at the moment around gamification, we can expect to see across many other industries. The launch of Dressed as an app where you can go, you can engage with an avatar, you can enjoy fashion, you might ultimately make some purchases, I think is a really good indication of how fashion is really running with the notion of gaming. And I would imagine that we will see other consumer sectors doing something similar. And then finally, within this space, the idea of digital fashion, the rise of digital fashion. I was talking some while ago about the Fabricant based in Amsterdam. You see the sorts of collaborations that they are doing around the digital fashion space, where garments don't actually exist in reality. That, I think, is a huge part of what we can expect to see. All of that driving, going back to the skills piece, completely different skills needs, different educational courses, all underpinning this new future of fashion. The other important debate here, of course, is what the environmental impact of this might be, how the fashion industry is using this sort of digital fashion to create prototypes, how in a world of fast fashion, we might think about enjoying fashion in a gamified way, as opposed to actually buying a garment. All of that, an important part, I think, of the conversation right now. Next slide, please. Gaming and music. So music, in the way that fashion is important and the idea of, what you wear in game is important, so is music. It's an important part of the games experience. And we've seen this, from the advent of games, really. But I would say that we are now seeing a much more integral relationship between music and games. I mean, we've seen the importance of games in music in games such as FIFA. But I think now, particularly after the last year and the experience of the pandemic and everything we've seen in terms of our ability or lack of ability to engage in physical spaces, this ability of the music industry to land in-game, I think has been something really which has been a huge trend. So everything from, obviously I think, Marshmello in Fortnite, Travis Scott, this piece for me is incredibly important. This relationship between what's happening in the music industry, what's happening in games right now, I think is an important area to look at. And as someone who's interested in this relationship between physical and digital, I think no more do you see this in the music. Next slide. I know we're going to talk a lot about esports today. If you are coming new to this space, the idea, this is effectively the sports model of gaming, multiplayer video games, competitively online or offline or online, and in venues potentially with spectators. I think in a way the tipping point for this industry was the Fortnite World Cup in 2019, when really we saw this come to prominence, and mainstream news channels were suddenly talking about esports. That was a tournament that attracted huge viewerships, and really I think coalesced attention around this industry in a mainstream way. Next slide, please. This is a really simple introduction, as if you are new to the space, about what does esports look like. It was described to me when I first started looking at as if you can think about it a little like sport, but the difference here is somebody owns the ball. That's the publishers. The publishers own the IP, so that would be Riot, EA, Activision Blizzard. So they are an integral part of this ecosystem. In the middle, you see the tournament organizers. These are the folk who are bringing together these tournaments, whether they're online or they're in physical places. They make it happen. They create the experience. This is where, for a super fan, you might come for a weekend and experience a whole range of activities around a game that you love, and come together with your community in a physical place, or you may be online and enjoying it with your online community. I would say here that's what's really important. The way the consumption of any of this content is entirely different, and the distribution platforms here are a unique part, I think, of what we've seen around this ecosystem. And I think one of the most interesting things about it, so Twitch, for example, and the influence of streamers and influencers here is incredibly important in understanding the culture of this sector and how people are engaging with this entire community in this world. Esports teams, esports players. This is a world where teams come together around particular games, particular IP. Again, it may surprise you to learn that these are teams who have requirements for much of what you might expect a traditional sports team to need. So training facilities, ecosystems that build in much more a familiar way if you're familiar with sports models. But the teams and the players, again, as in traditional sports, will have huge profile and will have many followers in the same way as influencers. And then finally, sponsors, brands and partners. For me, this is one of the transformative things happening in this sector. Traditionally, esports would have been sponsored by endemic brands. The entrance of non-endemic brands into this space, whether that's F&B, automotive, etc., and the interest that brands now take in this space, not least because of the audience presence here, is an incredibly important part of the changing landscape, I would say, of the esports world. Next slide, please. What does all this mean to real estate? Well, the applications are enormous, as you can imagine. There are the obvious things, there is what do office requirements look like? What do incubators look like? How might we think about education? What does all of this mean to experiential, destination, leisure and retail? How do we bring together ecosystems? What does events activity look like? What's the transferable IP here within this space? There is a lot to think about. The way that I describe it, and I think it's perhaps useful, is that if you were to apply a gaming lens across a whole range of different real estate assets, what would good look like? And how might you bring that together into something that lands and is relevant? I go back to that piece about community that I talked about. How do you create something that is relevant for that community? That's the strive here, I think, if you are in architecture and you're in real estate, or you're a brand trying to get into this space. Next slide, please. So how would I conclude? This is a space that is enormously significant. It is disrupting, it is innovating, it is creative, it is defining its own culture. I think that we are moving from a place where we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the big numbers. It is well established that this is a fast sector. It's newer but growing faster than other traditional creative sectors. For me, the interest here now is to talk about the impact of this sector. What does it mean in terms of how do you really create diverse, inclusive communities? What does it mean in terms of new learning and skills? What jobs are we going to see that come from this sector? What is the environmental impact of this sector? With 3 billion people spending their time in fantastical worlds, what's the impact of that, of the world that we live in, where we know we're facing a climate emergency? That for me is going to be key, I think, to the industry going forward. I am hopeful that we will see creative, disruptive, positive solutions come from this. I leave you with one last thought. You are a group of architects. I imagine that you are very familiar with the design of civic spaces in the real world. I would encourage you to go and have a look at a library space within a digital world. The Uncensored Library exists within Minecraft. It is a place designed by Journalists Without Borders. I would suggest taking a look at that as a sort of hopeful, positive place, and how genuinely how these physical and digital worlds are going to align. I'll leave you there.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Nikki. Now, our next speaker is Gavin Poole. He's the CEO of Here East. And I can remember Gavin taking me around Here East a few years ago, and we came to this absolutely massive space, no daylight, internal space. I said, what can you use this for? And he said, drone racing. It suddenly opened up a whole new world of what you use real estate for. So, Gavin, over to you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Nikki, for setting that up brilliantly. I'm probably going to recover some of those areas, but bring it to life in more of a operational, and as opposed to the theory behind it or the thinking that could be happening is actually what is physically happening now. So for those who are listening in and watching in, unfamiliar with Here East, where have you been for the last 9.5 years? But for those, I joke, but we're on the Olympic Park. We were the former International Press and Broadcast Centre. You see it there in the foreground of the image. The large building was all the TV studios. The smaller building on the right-hand side was more traditional offices where the journalists base themselves. And the copper brownie box in the middle is where is about 1,000-person capacity theatre space. Based on Olympic Park in the rear of the image, you can see the orbit, the stadium, the copper box between the two of us, Stratford out to the east. So it's a place where we won the right to take ownership of the building, develop it out, make a new creative and technology-based cluster in East London. And of course, it's on the home of London 2012. So when you start to put that together, you look at it and go, well, here we've got a place where technology meets sport, one of the major sporting events the world has. What a really exciting place to technology sport to collide. What do you get? And competitive gaming obviously comes to mind. So we've been on this journey ourselves now for about 5 to 6 years. And I'll talk you through. But before we get there, is that what are the key components from a real estate point of view about what it is about when you're trying to build what I say a cultural cluster of which gaming, game design, and then competitive gaming all sits. And you can start to hear that we've got various terminologies now which all get jumbled up and all confused, irritate a number of people, whether it's esports, competitive gaming, games, gaming, more connotations with gambling, and everybody who aren't industry specialists or just use these terminology freely. When we're building a cluster, what's really important is to make sure that we have the space which is able to satisfy the demands and the needs and the real estate needs for what we call the big, the small, and the different. We pride ourselves that we can do anything from a single desk up to a 145,000 square foot studio space. We can do everything in between as well. And I think that's really important when we're trying to create a space where technologies and creative and cultural businesses can come together, because we've got something that is right for everybody. What we found very early on when we were putting the whole vision together is the appeal of startup culture, the speed, the agility of how they grow is really important. So we started our own innovation center called Plexel, sits within the press center, and that's exactly what we deliver from event spaces through to meeting rooms, through to workshops, maker spaces, and then the businesses that come in, as I said, from one desk up to 30, 40, even one company we've grown from 12 to 92 people now, and they're still within Plexor, and then we help solve their real estate needs. Success is 3 founders, few £100,000 into Series B now, grown the company to over 70 staff, exited Plexor, and now have got their own studio and home within the core Here East development. It's kind of like a pipeline of opportunity that works for us. Within Plexor, we've got people doing in-game advertising like Bidstack. We've got mobile games developers. We've got more traditional games developers, and we've got software developers who are building platforms which allow you to create esport leagues with any type of game that you wish to develop as well. So there's a real cluster emerging within here. The spaces that we create range from offices, studio offices, through to cavernous studios themselves. And that provides you this range. And the big, small, and different is really, really important. And big does not mean large global corporate HQs with a real estate developer going, I need a pre-let of 250,000 square foot to get this thing going. It could be as simple, big, of being a large company wanting a 10,000 square foot studio for R&D. And that's the kind of things that we'll happily bring together, whether it's in automotive, which has a crossover to gamification, which has a crossover to buying esports teams, and which then leads them to launching products, not at the Detroit or the Paris Motor Show, but actually games conferences in Vegas. And that's kind of the move that Nick is talking about that we're seeing in the industry. And then our response to that and in that is making sure that our real estate can actually satisfy the needs and enable people to grow into those sectors. You take the empty space, and what do? We've create on the top, take you on a journey on the top right, the home of esports for Here East. We've got Staffordshire University with their Digital Institute London, with a full undergraduate degree courses looking at esports management, development, event management, digital game design, animation, and so forth. So creating a digital talent pipeline into this sector. We've also got other universities and robotics institutes and programs running with the likes of Airbus and Ford going on in UCL, top left. Large auditoriums. And the thing about the way that Here East works and the cooperation between all of our customers is that we're freely able to utilize all the spaces, and we're very collaborative. So we've got events running within UCL. It's not just for lectures. We had Skate USA, the Smithsonian, and the British Skateboard Association all running major events here within a skate a few years ago, whilst all the Street League was running in the Copper Box. And again, you can start to see that, again, more of the Digital Institute looking at how can we use these not just for students, but your point, Nikki, that you made about your anchor tenant is the community is something which we pride ourselves on, is actually how do you bring your community in, and how do you run community leagues, and how do you make sure people are aware of what's going on within your site. The crossover to culture and fashion and music, I said there are similarities to what Nikki was talking about, it's really important. And if you're trying to create a hub, which is a cultural creative hub based on technology, then all of these sectors are incredibly important, and they all have roles within the gaming and the esports sector. We've already spoken, I don't want to repeat what Nikki said, but some of the big esports teams, it's a brand, and a brand relies not just on the gameplay, not just on the influencers, but actually on the merchandise and the fashion. It's almost like a skateboarding subculture where you end up with the brands developing their own clothing range and their own styles. And you just, you see it in the younger kids as well. How many times do I get asked at home about, I need a t-shirt like this because Preston and his cohort are wearing them on YouTube or Twitch. So it's kind of like really important that you make sure that you've got spaces here so they can then bounce ideas off each other. And more importantly, they feel at home. They feel amongst people who really understand what they're doing and what they're trying to achieve. And again, matches fashion with us. We've got other digital retailers. We've got 5 music studios now. We've got a media academy. We've got photographic and fashion studios. And of course, the wonderful Wayne McGregor with his studios. And if you look at where the cultural and the dance world has gone over the past 15 months, well, that's actually like the music launches on Fortnite, or the premieres of Star Wars going on in game. Actually, you can take a new experience and reach a new audience by placing cultural entertainment within games and hit a brand new audience, which the brands are also trying to work towards. So you bring that all together and say, well, what has East got to do with all of this, and why esports? And we started on this journey, as I said, about 5 or 6 years ago. And for us, it's really important because we get this collision of tech and sport. But when you start joining the dots, as I've mentioned, in my previous slides, and we've got the likes of Loughborough University on site, and you can reach back into their main campus for the Human Performance Center. We've got strong relationships with the Formula One teams, and we've had Shadow Racing and some of their drivers with us. All of a sudden, your offer to teams is not just about space. It's actually about connections, collaboration, to make sure that they are finely tuned, that they're able to get the support, the strategy, the nutrition, the psychology that helps these gamers actually be at the height of their ability, and their reflexes and response is absolutely gone. Are the days where most people think computer game are played by the stereotypical person on the sofa eating crisps, drinking Coke. When you're at this level, these are athletes, and people start to laugh when you start talking about that. But when you get into the sector, nothing can be further from the truth. So I think for us, we looked at this and said, look, there's a real opportunity here for us. It's an interest. Most of us running Here East are involved in the day-to-day management of Here East, have got technology backgrounds, are interested in sectors such as this. It provides something really interesting where you've got broadcast content creators, you've got the software developers, you've got the in-game placement of brands and advertisements. You've got education, which sits alongside that, developing the talent pipeline. And if you look at where we sat in East London, a lot of this was going on around us anyway. We've got one of the largest belongs, apart from one in Oxford Street, sat over in Westfield with a very successful team, with the Westfield Spartans winning major competitions up in Birmingham with Insomnia, or at Insomnia. So already we have a community-based league. And for us, it was like, okay, let's think about this now. And now working with LLDC, we've taken them on a journey saying, look around the world, whether it's in Arlington, Texas, what's going on in Philadelphia, or down in New Zealand at the All Black Stadium, or in our own country with XL Esports over at Twickenham. There is this gathering of esports and sporting opportunities coming together, and we've got the Olympic Park. And you now look at the asset base. It makes no surprise to many people that we've got the Copper Box just alongside us, hosting regularly esports tournaments, 5,000 to 7,000 people, broadcasting live straight from the broadcast center with digital connectivity, a 2-minute walk away from where we are. So all of a sudden the appeal starts to bring. So it's not just about what does it do for Here East. For us as a regeneration project, and the major commitments being said publicly about what we want to do over 20 years on the park, is actually this is a community program. This is about building the teams, reaching into community, reaching into the schools, working with young people, showing what they can do. They're not all going to be players, but they can actually work in this sector should they choose to as well. And hopefully you can start to see for large developers, when you're looking at what this has an opportunity to do, all of a sudden you can engage the community, engage young people, enhance education, bring in new sectors, bring in major events, have a multi-use facility, and also have a lot of fun along the way. And I think that's really important. And hopefully that stimulate a lot of questions as we go through, and hand over to the next speaker.
Great. Thank you very much, Gavin. And yes, so our next speaker is Chi Bhatia. He's a senior designer at HKS. He's been working in the Far East, in UK and in the US, so has a lot of experience of different cultures, and he's going to tell us more about designing immersive entertainment venues. Chi, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm just double checking if I can control the screen. Perfect. Thanks NLA for having me, and Nikki and Gavin. Like you said, Gavin, I feel like we're building blocking. So, I think the timing of this is really exciting, and it's been really engaging, and hopefully the audience can see how this all pieces together. Our approach to esports and gaming is more under the more traditional sports entertainment or venues idea. And I'm going to talk about how our firm and me and a few colleagues are focusing on the kind of convergence of technology within kind of our built environment. And usually the who we are section is less important, but because it's NLA and it's a built environment, it's important for me to give everyone a background of why we've approached sports and entertainment in such a unique lens as designers, thinkers, strategists. And I'll talk about what convergence means for us, and finally end with some examples of what's already built, but also, you know, what's coming in the future. So as some context, you know, the globalization of our firm allows us to see ideas, like Gavin mentioned, you know, concepts and questions that are happening. We try to thread that together to understand, you know, what cultures want in different parts of the world. My background is between design and business. So I look at kind of our strategy, design, and kind of futures thinking and R&D process. And those are sort of our sports entertainment hubs around the world. How we're a bit different is that venues group is kind of where we live. Community and place have still an esports and gaming component to it, which I'll touch on, but the real venues focus, and that's where a lot of the capital is in, you know, creating consumer facing immersive environments that piggyback on what sports and performance have done globally. You know, brand design and business is what makes us slightly different to the normal architectural process. And that's because we've learned how to handle major franchises in the sports ecosystem to really understand how to generate revenue for the building. So if I could just focus your energy to phase one, the research and analysis bucket of our process allows us to work with, you know, real estate developers, brand designers, strategists, and that brief development is what curates the design process that most architects start usually in phase two. So the phase one aspect is even more important with the lens that I'm going to walk you through in terms of sports entertainment and esports. And how we've summarized that is this idea of revenue-based design, where our job as inventors, thinkers, architects is more about how to generate revenue and how to provide a more unique way of unlocking assets in the sports entertainment ecosystem. So the image on the left is kind of how a traditional stadium bowl is designed, and each one of those spaces is a new product for a fan, and therefore how does that create a new environment for different fan groups and clusters. And it's important to say it's not just about 80,000 seat venues, it's also about a flat floor event space. This is the Team Vitality space in Paris I'll touch on later. But revenue-based design applies there as well. How do you rent this asset? How do you look at technology? How do you kind of sell quantity of content as well? So, you know, revenue-based design is an important kind of mantra we go through. Quick snapshot of some of our projects in the more traditional sports ecosystem that a lot of the learning has come from operationally. And I just want to end on one last one, which is SoFi Stadium in LA that opened last year. I had the privilege of working on it for a few years, and that was really kind of blank piece of paper to complexity across 3 venues, a 70,000 seat stadium, outdoor plaza, and a performance arena. The performance arena and the video board is really unique. And, you know, if I was someone always asked me, the video board itself, you know, that is an immersive venue. You know, how do you take the learning and idea of content with human environments and design venues that allow you to engage with spectators? So think of this as part of the invention or the evolution of video boards and spectator environments being applied to some of the things I'll share later. And this kind of ends with esports. The performance venue, designed almost 5 years ago, was for esports teams, seats up to 6,000. But back then, esports as an event profile wasn't that large, so we really had to think about how to make it flexible for it. And that takes me to convergence. This is sort of our approach to the virtual and physical combining, and allowing different ways for brands and people to kind of mediate. And that's been built on 2 buckets, right? The consumption culture that younger fans want to generate content and absorb content digitally. And physically, the experience economy and kind of the desire that we've had and seen is that esports arenas are designing venues for a screen. And I think people often forget technology evolves. So how do LED and media servers and content kind of production systems provide value in a more unique way as we look at this physical digital kind of consumption convergence? So a way to summarize this for everyone is our approach to the ecosystem is summarized in kind of these 4 buckets of stakeholders. So esports and gaming teams and publishers have been our clients and projects, but so have traditional sports entertainment people and venues trying to want their brands to have an esports team in-house or rights holders. The neutral venues is more interesting. These are new ventures, new franchise models to create neutral content. And lastly, as Nikki mentioned, we are also exploring a lot of software as service in terms of creating metaverse content and using our relationship with Epic Games and Unreal Engine to design environments virtually. And we did some interesting work with behind closed doors. But the real complexity here is all these typologies of what you would imagine an esports space is. Each of these typologies could happen in each of the stakeholders. And I think sometimes people forget that you can't just have a esports arena for one stakeholder. It's for everybody. You know, a broadcast studio or production studio can be for a traditional sports team or a neutral venue. So this is just a snapshot at kind of all the different esports gaming technology typologies that we've seen. And lastly, I think because it's NLA and it's the built environment, it's also affected our own business model. You know, we as a company have grown a venture arm that looks at capital and equity in a new way. And all the research we know and projects we know, we're building our own IP in real estate, technology, and operations. And I'll touch on that in a little bit as well. But design, operate, build in the traditional stadium model is even more important with esports and gaming, to Gavin's point, where you need to know what the event calendar provides to sweat your asset. And that operational thinking we asked for much earlier than previous projects in traditional architecture. And that's something that we've been closer to really unlock value and understand, what do you mean by an esports arena? What do you mean by an esports space? And that comes down to flexibility. So all those bubbles on the right, those are different events in any given space. And to us, there's no such thing as an esports arena. It's about immersive content. It's about gamification and programming the space to appeal to different audiences. And one thing that's interesting is all those images on the right, the screen keeps getting bigger, right? So the screen keeps getting bigger, and therefore we're trying to standardize immersion ultimately. And that's an interesting topic.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed. That's fascinating stuff. And I just tell everyone in the audience that we are going to now have a discussion about some of those issues. So please do put your questions into the Q&A box for our speakers to respond to. But I'd just like to ask, start with a sort of general question about this, because of course, one of the things that has happened during COVID is that everyone has become more in tune with operating virtually. And Chi, you talk about the convergence of the virtual and the physical. Do you think COVID is going to actually accelerate this even more, and actually even spread it to a wider generational coverage, really, since we're now, might say, much more used to this a virtual world and moving into a hybrid world more generally? Chi, perhaps I'll start with you, then Nikki, and then Gavin.
I would say it's the timing of COVID with the younger generations being more digitally native, and both of those two things piggybacking to then allow digital usage of all genres of content to be more normal. So I think that's been a kind of coincidental aspect in terms of how normal digitization was pre-pandemic, during, and obviously post. I would have to say, you know, I'm obviously personally biased as a sports fan who works in, you know, creating immersive environments. I think the tribal experience of gathering together, whether that's to watch a movie in the cinema or sports or concerts, I think that pent up demand, you know, in the next 18 months, next 6 months, hopefully, will only bring back normality in that way. I think there'll be small changes to how people gather and safety protocols and more awareness to it, but I don't see the larger physical gathering and immersion changing too much in the next few years.
Nikki, what do you think the impact of COVID is going to have? Do you see this acceleration, or what sort of changes?
I think for me, what this creates is, you know, the word, it's such a cliche to talk about fast accelerations, but I think there has been a fast acceleration into digital models. Industries that were there already are just becoming more innovative and more disruptive in terms of how they were operating and how they now operate. Industries that weren't looking at digital have had to pivot quick into this space. I think, you know, just building really on what she says, for me, the interesting thing here is, you know, at a point that it's safe for people to return to physical places, it strikes me that will be very much part of the landscape. The challenge and the opportunity here is how you bring together physical and digital models. If you take esports, for example, an esports tournament where you've got people physically present in a venue, you've also got a huge online audience. And I think the opportunity, the challenge there is, how do you bring together for people who, and you know, we see this in the workspace, how do you bring together the experience for people who are physically present with people who are elsewhere? So I think we're going to be talking a lot about this kind of alignment of physical and digital, how you create a seamless experience for consumers.
Gavin,
I was going to say I think that the last 15 months has done a greater transition onto screen technology, particularly when you look at the growing audience on the games platforms, and where as parents, and I've got two smaller ones myself, many up until March last year, it was always about keeping them off the screen as much as possible and doing more physical. Actually, the transition was, yes, you can still do physical in the home, but keeping contact, being with their friends was actually all virtual. So they became, and I think the parents became more normalized to the use of screen technology for staying in touch. And actually part of that was playing games. And part of that is then moving into looking at what does that mean in terms of competitive gameplay while sitting with a headset and microphone, talking to their mates who might be in this country, might be overseas, and might be people they've never met before. I know that's a whole safeguarding discussion, which is running riot within Westminster at the moment. But all of a sudden, your connections are vast. Bringing that back into what does that mean for the future about major events? Well, they were there. I mean, I mentioned before in the copper box, which you sort of see behind my head here, it was already got 5,000 to 7,000 people regularly being there, whether it's for Call of Duty, League of Legends or whatever, and there'll be more to come. I know it's being booked up next year now, a huge amount of times ready for esports, but it's about what goes on around that. You go in there for a tournament for 2 days, but not just going to sit there for 2 days. It's all the activations then. And I think that's what we were looking at from a strategy, from a park point of view, is the activations that go on around a major tournament to keep people engaged. It's like going to it's like going to CES or going to South by Southwest. It's not just the main stage. It's everything else that the publishers or the developers or the support networks actually put on around you, about how you do the community engagement and how you actually get those who've gone to watch can then actually participate in mini leagues, sub leagues, or sub tournaments. And I think it's getting that right shows that when you're looking at courses and you're looking at talent pipeline, it's not just about the gamers. It's not just about the software companies. It's actually about the eventing industry, the event managers, the creatives, the designers, the fabricators. All of these things are incredibly important to make sure this sector thrives.
Great, thank you very much. Well, we start actually with another question for you, Gavin. Katie Clements Jackson asked what sort of things should be considered for designing spaces to let gamers play at the top of their game. I'm a building services engineer, so I'm interested in the environmental conditions as well as the spaces and potentially psychological considerations. So
excellent. And I'm going to defer to Chi at some point on this one because he's the designer, he's the expert on this. But from all the work that we've done, the research we've done, it's a number. It depends what you're doing. It depends. Gamers in some disciplines are incredibly noisy. So the soundproofing is basically to protect the rest of us from them practicing in the swim rooms. In other areas, it's incredibly quiet as they're concentrating and they're absolutely laser focused. And I'm talking about simulator drivers, for example. So it depends on what they are doing. But if you think you can put the teams and the players underneath the stage somewhere and the back office, then I think that's the wrong. You've actually got to look after them. You would not provide your Premier League player with a facility which is secondary to where you think your major revenue is coming from. So it's got to be spacious, design, well considered, access, outdoor space, really important. They're not just going to sit inside all day playing game. And I don't think it's just about the space. It's actually what else is around you. I mentioned before about access to the sports therapist, the nutritionist. It's access to how close are the team facilities. So for us, Athletes Village or East Village across the park, they're a fantastic opportunity to bring all the teams, their managers, the strategists, their support staff all together. So they not only come to a training camp, but they all live together as well. It's a bit like taking the triathletes and they all head off to Corfu for a week, getting together, being together, living together, working together. I think all of these things need to be brought into consideration when you're looking about what are you designing, and it's an end-to-end design for where you sleep to where you play.
Chi, did you want to add anything to that?
Absolutely, Peter. And I think the same person who asked the question asked a similar one as well on kind of carbon emissions on it. I would say it's kind of ironic because I think the temporary events and the power they consume often go under the radar. So I would say that actually, in my mind, needs more of a innovation angle on how to provide that in a more sustainable way as they scale and grow. In terms of permanent builds, I would say exact same principles that apply to a broadcast studio space for the BBC, for example, or a space for a performance venue. There's really not too much difference in power usage or consumption over most other venues already. The things Gavin mentioned in spatial adjacencies, I think that's a given, but from a carbon emissions aspect, as LED gets more efficient and as LED gets more technology and capital into it, we're only using some of those panels I showed you at 49% even. And they don't even give off heat. So even the usage and consumption, the efficiency of that technology is getting much better. And therefore I would say, the technology always is the distracting aspect of energy efficiency, but general principles to building design, I think, still remain, just like any other standard entertainment experience or a black box, as an example.
Thanks. And Daniel Birdsall asks, do you see esports being a feature to the UK future high street in towns across the country? So Nikki, she showed a few sort of retail units. Do you see this as a big thing now, as maybe a part of the recovery of the high streets even?
Well, I guess my perspective on this is when you think about games culture, that and I think everything that we've all talked about suggests that this is an industry that is affecting all other industries within technology creative spaces. So I think from a retail perspective and a high street perspective, there are multiple different ways that you might imagine that sort of cultural influence will be seen across high streets, where when you look at the way that brands are engaging with this space, who are not traditionally in this space, and I think that's one of the interesting things to think about, that in my view will have incredible impact across all sorts of types of physical spaces, including high streets. In terms of esports, I think, to Chi's point, I think, that there has typically been this interest in the sort of huge scaled stadium projects. Of course, people are interested in that. But, I think the project that, that was talked about, where you have a space that can evolve across a day, across a life cycle, that can do lots of different things and be adaptive about all the needs of this industry, for me, is what's really quite interesting here. And I think at a high street level, that's what I would anticipate seeing, that, that we might see this culture being infused across spaces and used in lots of evolving different kinds of ways by different kinds of brands.
Thanks, Gavin.
I think when you look at it, you see the evolution of the sports bar. When it all became mainstream on TV, then the sports bar appeared initially in America and then across into Europe, where people would go and watch their teams whilst meeting up with their mates and having a beer. That's already started to move on. We've got Four Quarters with us, which is a video games cocktail lounge, where you've got competitions running in booths or across onto the main screen within the bar area itself, and that's already there. You've seen the expansion of Belong as Mike Ashley's team sold that to Vindex. You just look at what Vindex are out to achieve, and are already looking at rolling that out across the US. And that is mainstream already on our high streets, where a lot of the youngsters will go to. Yes, okay, it was a marketing ploy to bring young people in and buy the games titles, but all of a sudden you're starting to see that flip around a little bit more, about the youngsters are now being there just to play. Play by the hour, play by the weekend, or whatever, and it's not a consequence, it's by no sort of lack of design that Microsoft, when they built their facility on the corner of Oxford Street and Regent Street, they took an entire floor out as a gaming zone. And when you go down and you're downstairs looking at all of the PCs and the future of the systems that they've got coming to the market, actually it's the upstairs which is full. With young people who are there playing and getting advice and putting together their teams, and that's the draw, that's the appeal. So it's already happening.
So what about wider impact? So I mean, when you have lots of young people coming down to the Olympic Park to go to the Copper Box, I mean, if you look at Insomnia, great halls of the NEC are full of tents. It's like sort of Glastonbury indoors. And so one needs to provide that's a sort of wider impact on both the local economy and in terms of what you have to deliver if you're providing these sort of events, isn't it?
For us, absolutely, and I think there's the right places for the right spaces. Birmingham is a brilliant host for that. Is that right for the Copper Box and the Park? Probably not. As we move into, what is the stadium used for? There's a lot of the opportunities which are unused at the moment, which is why LLDC are really interested to work with us on the wider esports strategy for the Olympic Park. It's a lot of unlocked potential in the asset base that sits there. But of course, in London, we've got the Excel already over there. We've got the arena over in Wembley as well. And there's other locations across the capital, large locations, which are being used. All of a sudden, you're looking at, this is kind of like a mini esports festival across an entire city, for example. London Tech Week, why don't we just throw that out and say, well, what about the esports? We've created, with partners, a 3-day esports festival this September. And the demand is absolutely there. We've got no problems filling the speakers, we've got no problems getting the tickets, we've got no problem people wanting to come over the 3 days that we're hosting it. So there's lots of opportunity, but it should not just be here east in the park. We've got to look at nationwide and the city.
Yeah, great. So this is one for you, Chi. I think Amanda Brecknell is asking, I'd be interested to know how to balance sightlines and staging needs requirements of the many different uses of the esports auditorium. How does this affect the shape and connectivity of the audience to different uses?
Yeah, amazing question. One of my slides slightly covered it. We've done, obviously, 20 plus years of sightlines for traditional stadiums, and we have algorithms and scripts that produce that and validate that. We've taken all of that analysis and modified it to how the human eye and periphery cones of vision affect digital content, based on the size of the pixels, size of 16:9, 4:3 ratios, as well as physical, C values, as they're called, to the physical event. So we are actually, under lock and key on IP on that to try to own that patent, let's say, high level, because that's something that really has not been defined. And we've kind of figured that out over the last 4 years, even talking to top gaming publishers, because their one-off events are more temporary. So they're not going to invest in permanent infrastructure because they don't own the venue. So we think that's changing. So a lot of our research has exactly been in that question, is how do you then provide immersion in a new way, but also how do you make it safe? Because, how long has someone spent sitting in a ball of LED for 5 hours? Mm-hmm. And that's where we are right now, is testing that hypothesis that we don't have the answer yet to, but we're getting there.
Yeah, Nikki, yes.
Yeah, just one last point I'd like to make, that, I think in my world, the question that's really being asked a lot is about existing space and retrofit of existing space for this industry. So I think for architectural practices and real estate generally, there've been attempts to take esports into existing spaces. Some have worked better than others. But I think if you are thinking about this space, clearly there is a lot of space right now that is looking for a function and looking for a purpose, excuse me. So I think that is, in a way, something to keep uppermost in the mind, is how do you take any of this and how do you think about retrofit, and what does any of that mean?
If I were to add just one thing to that point, and I guess a wider point that we came across only a few weeks ago in our kind of Q2 strategy session, was amusement parks. What Disney have done and what amusement parks are, we think that what sports entertainment and esports is becoming is so much closer to that experience. And there's good things and bad things to that. It's very personal and subjective, so I don't have an opinion on it, but that's something we're noticing more and more, so that this LBE, location-based entertainment, is based on what amusement parks have done, and to give Disney the most credit, for generations. And it's really turning into that environment.
Yeah, I would dive into that, and I say, that ecosystem, that park, that gaming lens across multiple different types of space is really important. But I think, just picking up on what Gavin said, it feels to me this is like, this is like music festivals, this is like Glastonbury, this is like somewhere arrives in town. I love the idea, by the way, of a London Games Festival. Why don't we do that? Mm-hmm. It's festivals arriving in a place. And this is an industry that has the capacity to really drive footfall. So that feels like, yeah, that's a great idea, Gavin.
To give credit to Yuki, they have a London Games Festival, which we sponsor, but specifically around competitive online gaming esports festival is absolutely where we should be looking at.
Let's do that.
Great. So you're going to get that going, Gavin?
That's the spin out probably from Stackfest in September, I suggest.
Very good. Well, we're up to time, so I should call things a halt. But it's very interesting, actually. If anyone's talking about the architecture, you have on one side Xi's very specifically designed spaces, which one of which look rather like the way you stage an opera, actually, about the sort of the way you bring the audience to the screen, and then you have on the other side the open and flexible spaces that Gavin has to play with. It's so it's very interesting, the impacts it has on architecture and the use of space, as well as, of course, the entertainment it provides. And I look forward to the London Festival, and thank you all very much for attending. Thank you to our speakers. And I just tell the audience that in a moment a little poll will turn up on the screen. We'd be very grateful if you could just fill that in, because it really helps us make sure we're getting the programming right for our NLA events. So thank you all very much for absolutely fascinating hour on new technology in the environment. So thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.